Okay, do you have anything left?
Nope.
Do you guys have anything left?
Escape.
An escape. Fantastic. Do you have anything left? Free. Like, you mean you feel free there, or it's a free place to go? You feel free. Okay. Anything else that's on your list that we don't have? Okay. What's that?
Simple.
Simple. Yeah, like maybe feel simple where you're going to. Okay, I'm curious to hear. Sophie, what was your favorite place? What did you choose?
I chose the Redwood Forest.
The Redwood Forest? Awesome. Have you been there before, or is it a place you want to go?
I only went there once. Yeah.
Yeah, but it stuck with you. Like it was that powerful. Your experience there was
Yeah,
so powerful that you're like, this is a really special place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Robbie, will you share quickly with what your place was?
In Red Lodge, there's like a nature preserve that I like to go to, that I can get on top of these like giant cliffs. Hannah's been there with me. Yeah, and it's just like, it's super cool to just like, yeah, you can see the whole valley.
Awesome. Lauren, what about you?
Mine's in Mexico. It's on a rooftop basketball court. It's like on the resort. You can have like the ocean, you have palm trees.
And you get to play basketball. It's like your
All
perfect
night, yeah.
world all in
Everything,
one.
Yeah.
I love it. That's awesome. Hannah, what did you choose? New York, tell us. Why? Isn't this wonderful? Yeah. I love that you chose the word simple to describe New York City, right? I love it. Like our interpretations of these places are so different from one another's. Does anybody else want to just share your favorite place? Did anybody choose a place you want to share out? Elena?
It looks like Crystal Lake.
Awesome. Where's Crystal Lake?
It's up in the mountains. I don't know where.
Is it here in Montana? But you've only been there once. Okay, that's awesome. How many of you chose a special place that you've only been to maybe once or twice? It's not some place you've spent hours and hours and hours of your life. Raise your hand if you chose a place like that. Okay, that's awesome. How many of you chose a place that's kind of like your second home? Like you've spent so much time there, it's like a second home. That's awesome. And then I've just got to share Centuries because I love it so much, but she chose Pioneer Park. It just like makes me so happy for lots of reasons. So my next question for you is this. We can all think about these special places. We have a connection. On some level, there's a reason that these places stand out to us, even if we've only been there once or twice. Like that experience was so powerful, it stuck with us, or it's our second home, and it's just where we love to be more than anywhere else. But I want you to think now about the history of the place you chose. And by history, I mean like the whole history of that place. Like, do you know what that place was or was like 50 years ago, or 100 years ago, or 200 years ago, or 500 years ago? Like, what do you know about that history? And if you don't know anything, what do you sort of speculate the history of that place might have been? Sort of a what's the story-ish kind of thing, okay? So I'm going to give you just a couple of minutes, and I want you to reflect on, like, what do you really know about the history of that spot? Okay, so tackle that. What's the history of your special place? Think about how far back your own knowledge of this place goes. And then what was it like before that, before you have a knowledge of it? if you get stuck and you really don't know anything, then maybe think about, well, what would you like to know? If you don't know anything about the history of your place, why don't you know that history? What would you like to know about it? Let's just take another minute to finish up our thoughts on this. Awesome, thank you. Okay, share out at your tables. What do you know? What do you know about your places?
You got this. You got this. You like that, right? You like finish. And make sure you like put it here at the end of your sentence. Also, don't capitalize anything right in your word. Alright, put it here at the end. You sure? I can't see it. Alright, you wanna go or should I? Alright.
So yours was a man-made thing?
Mine was pretty simple. I kind of just said it hasn't really changed. But I made it look so I was like, for sure the water has chipped away at the stone, and new trees and plants are taken over for the ones that have died. But it has almost entirely remained unmarked from the state. Yeah, I know. I had like 2 sentences to write, so I made it good. Although I didn't word the second sentence exactly like that.
I don't really know anything about.
Alright. Oh, you chat.
Always been just like a forest.
I don't know.
Never like
I said that I honestly don't really know.
Yeah, I just want to know about like
history.
what it would be like to like
Valid.
live there. Yeah.
She was saying that we did the trees, but she has since it was started. Sorry, can I
Step out. Step out.
okay.
The horses on Flathead.
Well, I was just trying to figure out getting
Yeah,
these
they're
guys.
on the. I know they're. I think it was the Army.
But they just responded.
There was like no house. There was
My therapist.
it was 100% tribal land, so no one ever lived over there. And
I was like, hey, any chance we could reschedule it a little bit earlier?
like when I was like also my
It's been approximately 95% of my time. She just comes by.
Okay, I have a question.
Put it down, have a mini
How many of
conversation.
you, raise your hand if you feel like you definitively know the history of your place and exactly what it was like 50 years ago? Like you can say with certainty, like, I know exactly what this place was like and the history and who was here and who wasn't here and what this land was used for 50 years ago. Maybe. What about 20 years ago? 10 years ago? Yeah, you can probably safely assume, kind of, right? I mean, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about. Like, we love these places. They're important to us. But when we stop and really ponder, like, what are these places? Who else has called this place home? Who else has this place been special to? What has this place been used for? Who else has stepped on this ground? Like, those questions become really difficult to answer. So we're going to be thinking about why it can be important to recognize that the land that we consider to be special and important to us maybe has a history, certainly, definitely has a history that predates us and probably predates, you know, the history that even our relatives or our recent ancestors have any knowledge or memory of, and probably going back to time immemorial, right? And that this idea that when we stop and consider the history of these places and the history of the people who likely also loved and thought these places were really special, and that there's value in knowing and recognizing that history, it can actually sort of transform our ability to better understand the environment, the places around us, and also the people in the history that are still living and still part of these places as well. So that's kind of where we're headed with this idea of a land acknowledgement. Before we get there though, let's tackle the actual history of some of our places. So now you do need your Chromebook. So jump on your Chromebook and go to our Google Classroom for today. And you're gonna find a slide deck, like a Google slide deck posted there, and you need to go to this third slide. You don't need the first two. The first two are just what we've already done in case anybody was absent today. Robbie's on a roll today. Yes, definitely. Okay, so this is the slide you should be looking at when you get there. I know it'll take a second to get there. For some of you, this is going to be easier than others. Some of you might actually have to use like Google Maps maybe even to kind of figure out where you're going to go from here. But here's our goal. Here's what we're going to try to do. If you know your place, like for example, like I know the zip code of my favorite place is 98250. Like I know that. You might know the zip code of your favorite place. Maybe it's right here in Billings and you know like, hey, that's 59101. If you don't, you're going to have to use the zip code map. So you're going to click on that link and it's going to take you to a zip code map where you can kind of determine the zip code of the place you've chosen. So you can search by city or county. Now this only works if your place is in the United States. So you might not need the zip code. Like there's a different resource you can use here in a minute, Lauren. So maybe sit tight, but use Google Maps and like try to pinpoint, try to find your spot on the map, okay? The rest of you, use this. You can zoom out. Like obviously, I the last time I did this, I searched, you know, somewhere in Idaho or something like that. So you can just type in a general, you know, I think this is by such and such, California or whatever, and then you can kind of zoom out and see if you can find the actual zip code of your favorite place. And once you've got the zip code, write it down in your journal. You're going to need to keep a little log of this information so that you can use it. Is there a particular, like the whole state of Montana, right? And we have like a handful of zip codes. Look at that. That's insane. You can probably zoom in and out. Yeah, use the toggle to go in and out. You can kind of maybe find it a little more specifically. Then you might have to choose at least the regions in your life. Moving forward, that's what you're going to do. Okay, awesome.
How do you zoom out more than a little bit? I want to see the entire group.
Well, there's a plus and minus right there, maybe. Maybe type in a different state or type in like what it is specifically you're looking for. Sophie, did you have some luck? Okay. Yeah, that's a good call.
That's nice.
That's awesome. I love it. Fantastic. Lila, what was your place? Where? Yeah. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do now. If you were able to identify your zip code, then there's a resource posted on our Google Classroom that you're gonna be able to use pretty quickly. If not, there's an additional resource, and actually they're both fantastic, so I'm gonna encourage you to play around with both of them a little bit. So Code for Change lets you type in a zip code, and you're gonna precisely find out which indigenous peoples have called that place home historically. So with the information that we have about tribes and Native American peoples, like who has called this place home before, this resource, Native Land Digital, does the same kind of thing. It's just way broader and you don't need your exact zip code for it. I want you to try to use both, and I want you to compare and contrast the information you get. And then I want you to record in your journal, like, what indigenous tribes have inhabited, used, lived on, migrated through, called that area where your special place is home. I'm gonna give you like maybe, I don't think this will take super long. I'll check back in with you in like 3 or 4 minutes and see if we've been able to find that information.
Why are there little spotted areas on the zip code map where it's like weird looking zip codes that overlap with each other?
I have no idea.
Like look at this.
I'm not a zip code expert.
I'm guessing this is like Left Fork and Long Rock Creek, but it's like weird shape.
Where's the zip code map?
This
Like-
is the zip code.
So what?
This is the zip code.
So it's following the river, right? The boundary is following the river, I think, is what you're looking at.
It's just such a weird shape.
Well, it's following the road, right? Isn't that the road to Belfry?
Trail of Tears, yeah.
I think it's probably just following landmarks that exist would be my guess. I don't.
Yeah.
Or yeah, it's following the roads.
Okay.
And the roads are weird shaped because of all the obstacles in the way. Would be my guess. I don't know.
So wait, which zip code are you writing down?
Maybe pick where your cabin is, right? Like if it's something you walk to from your cabin, then pick the zip code for your cabin. That would be what I would suggest. Yeah. You gonna be able to find it? Where's your cabin at? Is it north or south? Towards Roberts? This way. So yours is towards the Beartooth? Like towards the Beartooth Highway? Mm-hmm. No, you're right. Is it right along the Lake Fork? Or like Rock Creek? Do you know which fork of the Rock Creek it's on? Yeah, like the main fork, the west fork, the Lake Fork. I would just pick probably whatever this is. Do you know which, when you're driving to your cabin, do you go east or west? Yeah, then just pick whatever that is. Okay, and if you finish that already while we're still waiting for everybody to catch up, there's another resource here, the language resource. If you click on this is kind of cool. If the place you chose was in Montana, although I think this probably is just Montana, I need to check on that. You can actually, if you scroll down, you can use this tool. You need to go to page 2 of this tool right here, and you can actually hear the names spoken in indigenous languages. So like instead of like let's say my spot had been historically inhabited by people of the Crow tribe. What do the people of the Crow tribe actually call themselves in their own native language, and what does that sound like? Is pretty cool. Yeah, absolutely. Or along those lines. So you can kind of like get a feel for like, oh, what did the names of these people actually sound like? So you can play around with that while we kind of wait for everybody else to get their list.
Something I was just thinking about was like place names that have indigenous names too. Like Red Lodge is an indigenous name because that was, I mean, it's English interpretation, but that the story of the Red Lodge with the mountain crow. So, right, like I just was thinking about that as another part of what you could do. And then the Department of Interior right now is working on, so Biden and Holland are taking all of the S word out of all, and then they already did it in Montana. They took the S word out and then half breed as well. So
Isn't that amazing?
it'd be nice to get some of those. There's some like Hayden Valley and Yellowstone. So
I know.
these things are really important because if we name something a place, that
This is crazy. Some really good friends of ours who love Yellowstone. Named their son Hayden after Hayden Valley. You know, he's in his
not even
20s
really
now,
knowing.
not knowing anything.
Yeah.
And now, think about that. Right? Like this was like a profoundly important place to you.
But
And the name didn't resonate as having any sort of connotation or history because we
yeah.
and luckily now maybe we will.
Yes,
We're
maybe.
starting.
Yes, you are, Sarah. You are
We're
starting. Making it
But
happen.
yeah, I mean,
I know. That's. I'm going to use that story. That's a really good story.
interesting.
So there's an interesting thing with names as well. In the foreign language classes, asking students to change their name to a Spanish name. And there was a little girl, she's from Mexico. She's been back and forth between the United States and Mexico her whole life. And her name is Summer. And they asked her to change her name. And she was like, my name is Spanish. And they're like, no, that's the Spanish. We would want you to have the Spanish word for it. And so, right? Could you imagine like asking an indigenous student to change their name? Because we get our names change as we get older from deeds, right? So then like that really resonates with me. So just like thinking about that, and asking, or like what if the student's name was, you know, Eladio or Jesus or. And I remember kids always asking, "What's my name in Spanish?" And you're like, "Your name is still Sarah.
Right.
It's still Sarah in Spanish, right?
Because it's your name.
We wouldn't say a different name in Spanish. But yes, like knowing other names and how to say Spanish names.
To add to this, actually, like the history of the name of the place.
Yes.
What was your place called? Not just what were the indigenous people
Like
called.
Billings, how many people know
What was
like
the
what
name of
Billings?
it?
Or like what they did with Colson,
Yes,
right? Like they
right.
ripped it out, put a landfill in because there was like a rivalry, and then named it Billings, and just picked a place on a plant, and then met.
I'm gonna add that.
So inspiring.
Yes.
Yes.
I love hearing it. Sounds cool, huh? I love it. Okay, how many of you did we find our places? We found our places on the map. We were able to use the resources to make a little list, right? How many of you have at least, one known group of indigenous people or tribe that inhabited that area? What about 2? 3? 4? Okay, yeah, 4. Were there more than 4 for yours? That's awesome. And that doesn't surprise me on the coast. That's so interesting. So here's what we're gonna do. I know we're kind of running out of time, but we're gonna go ahead and start the next piece of this, which is really sort of starting to think about and understand what it means to learn about the history of these places. So when I was thinking about this and thinking about everything that we do in this class that's tied right here to our local environment, our ecology lessons and our water ecology and our winter ecology and all the stuff that we're doing, we're very much centered on the Yellowstone ecosystem, the greater Yellowstone ecosystem, right? Like everything that we've been studying, we put in the context of where we are, and where we are is the greater Yellowstone. And the greater Yellowstone area, and it's very fitting that this is also the 150th year of celebrating the national parks. So I don't know if you've heard that, but it's been in the news, and like, oh yeah, it's 150 years of the establishment of Yellowstone National Park specifically. And so much celebration around that and what national parks mean to us. And so we're gonna take a little listen to a really awesome podcast that's produced called Parks. It's the Parks podcast. But it's a retelling of the history of these spaces in terms of what the real and accurate history of these places was prior to the establishment of the national park system by the US government. And so who were the people that inhabited these lands? What did that look like? Were there multiple people? Was it a migration? Like, what was happening in these lands? And really start to think about, how does the history we're going to hear in this podcast change or mold with, or in some way, alter the way that we've kind of interpreted the history of Yellowstone? And I want you to just think about that for a minute. Like, even when we watched the video about Yellowstone in winter, right? And what was the whole thing about? Like, what was the vibe of that entire film?
Yes.
Who's Yellowstone for? It's for the animals, right? And it's always been that way. It's this pristine place of solitude, untouched, pristine. No humans have ever messed with Yellowstone National Park, right? Like, that's very much the ethos of the national park system, that somehow we came in and we were able to recognize the beauty of this place and, put a little border around it and say, this is a pristine national park that we're going to preserve because it's as of yet untouched by humans. And we don't want it to be touched by humans. And we're going to save this for, the animals to roam free, and then, people who have the means or the time or whatever can pay money to then come in and enjoy that nature, right? And that's very much the story we all grow up hearing about Yellowstone. Maybe you know a little bit about Lewis and Clark, and maybe you know a little bit about Jim Bridger, who turned back or whatever and did his thing in Yellowstone, and certainly all the places in Yellowstone that are named for those people. But we never hear about what Yellowstone National Park was like before the late 1800s, right? We only hear about what Yellowstone Park has been like since then. So we're going to listen to this podcast. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll just get a couple minutes into it, and that's okay. What I want you to do is I just want you to journal as we go. What are some of the things that stand out to you? What questions does this make you consider? Does it cause you to reevaluate your perspective? Or even just, is there a cool fact that you're like, whoa, I didn't know that. I've never heard of that before. And I'll stop in time to give you a second to put your stuff away. Okay, so we'll just listen until we've got maybe a minute or so left, and we're going to go from there. I do want to point out that this is a nonprofit, basically, podcast that's trying to sort of retell the stories of the national parks alongside Indigenous history. But the first episode they did was on Yellowstone, and the primary person that they interview in this is a gentleman named Dr. Shane Doyle. He is actually an enrolled member of the Crow tribe and grew up in Crow Agency here in Montana, and has really become an expert on connecting Indigenous history to our places in this area. So it's pretty cool that this first episode had such a deep local connection to us.
If you haven't done that, it's incredible. I mean, when you drive this road, you see people washing dresses on roads and lakes. I want to take this just to this being.
We don't want both at the same time, though.
Parks aims to be a radically transparent journalistic project, one that details our ethics and processes openly. As an entirely independent venture, Parks relies on donations to compensate all involved for their labor and knowledge. So all donations will go towards both covering up